My name is Clara, 33 years old, and my profession is managing distressed assets for a massive investment fund in Chicago. That means I deal with bankruptcies, foreclosures, and financial ruins every single day. Yet nothing prepared me for the financial and emotional bankruptcy of my own family. Just leave the house key on the counter and do not ever come back. My father. Richard threw those words across the Thanksgiving table like a casual observation about the weather. My mother, Patricia, just stared at me and nodded in agreement. This house was never yours anyway. Before I could process the cruelty of those words, my younger sister, Audrey, shoved a suitcase toward me. It was already packed with my belongings. They had erased me from the house room by room, while I was at work preparing to toss me into the freezing Chicago winter. But they made one fatal miscalculation. They had no idea that their cruel eviction would trigger a chain of events ending with me owning their entire lives. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth and used your kindness against you. The tension had been thick from the moment I arrived at my parents' sprawling suburban home that Thursday evening. The dining room was suffocatingly hot, smelling of roasted turkey and the expensive cologne worn by my brother-in-law Jamal. Jamal is a 32-year-old African-American man who calls himself a startup founder. He wears custom Italian suits and speaks entirely in buzzwords about venture capital and market disruption. But as I sat quietly at the end of the table watching him pour a $300 bottle of Cabernet into his crystal glass, I knew the truth. He bought that wine using my parents' credit cards. He bought the new crystal chandelier hanging above our heads with their money, too. Audrey, sitting next to him in a silk dress she certainly did not pay for, laughed loudly at a joke my father made. She is 30 years old, the undisputed golden child of the family raised to believe the world owes her luxury simply for existing. While I spent my 20s climbing the corporate ladder in finance, analyzing debt portfolios, and working 60-hour weeks, Audrey spent hers, curating a flawless social media presence funded by the bank of mom and dad. I took a slow sip of my water, focusing on the rhythmic clinking of silverware. For 5 years, I had lived in the basement apartment of this house. It was not a handout. I paid market rate rent every single month. My parents needed the income to maintain their lavish lifestyle, and I had agreed because I believed family supported family. I even paid out of my own pocket to completely gut and renovate the basement, transforming a damp storage space into a beautiful modern suite. I thought I was investing in my family property. I thought I was safe. The clinking of silverware stopped abruptly when my father cleared his throat. He set down his linen napkin and folded his hands on the table, fixing his gaze squarely on me. "Clara." He began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he reserved for reprimanding employees. "Your mother and I have made a decision about the property. We need you to vacate the basement suite immediately. Tonight, actually." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the suddenness of the demand. "Tonight," I repeated, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Dad, it is Thanksgiving night. The temperature outside is dropping below freezing. We have exciting news!" Audrey chimed in, leaning forward with a bright performative smile that did not reach her eyes. "Jamal has secured a massive group of angel investors for his new tech platform. They are flying in from New York, and we are going to lease the entire house to them as a corporate retreat space while they finalize the funding." Jamal nodded smoothly, swirling his expensive wine. "It is a high-level networking strategy, Clara. These guys are heavy hitters. They expect absolute exclusivity and luxury. Having a corporate drone living down in the basement just completely ruins the aesthetic of the deal." My mother finally spoke up, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We knew you would understand, darling. You are always so practical. Besides, you have a good job. You can easily find an apartment downtown closer to your office. It is really a win for everyone." A heavy silence fell over the room. I looked at the faces of the people I shared blood with. There was no hesitation, no guilt, no remorse, just pure, calculated selfishness. "You want me to leave tonight?" I said slowly, making sure I understood the exact parameters of their betrayal. "What about the $150,000 I spent renovating that basement? I paid for the new plumbing, the hardwood floors, the custom kitchen. I increased the value of your property." My father scoffed loudly, waving his hand as if swatting away a fly. "That was your choice to spend money on a space you were only renting. As the property owners, any improvements revert to us. Consider it back pay for all the years we raised you." Audrey slid the black suitcase across the polished hardwood floor until it bumped against my chair. "We packed the essentials for you," she said casually. "The rest of your things will be put in storage. Jamal has investors arriving tomorrow morning, and we need the space completely sterilized of your presence." My mother reached across the table, her manicured hand outstretched. "I will take the house keys now, Clara. Like your father said, this house was never yours. Do not make this harder than it needs to be. Just leave the key, take your suitcase, and get out right now." The heavy black suitcase bumped against my shins again. Audrey leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms with an air of absolute superiority. She looked me up and down, taking in my practical gray blazer and sensible flats. "You have to understand how this looks, Clara," she said, her voice laced with mock sympathy. "Jamal and I are building a luxury brand. We are stepping into the elite circles of Chicago real estate and venture capital. When these major investors arrive tomorrow, they expect to see success. They expect to see a family of high net worth individuals who understand the aesthetics of power and wealth. Having a mid-level corporate drone living in the basement doing her little 9-to-5 routine completely ruins our image." She gestured toward the crystal wine glasses and the expensive centerpiece. "We cannot have billionaires walking through our property and seeing you doing laundry or carrying groceries down the side path. It disrupts the narrative of prosperity we are projecting. Jamal needs to close this deal, and your presence here is a liability. You drag down our entire brand and our future. We need this property to look like a millionaire playground," he added arrogantly. "Your boring lifestyle just does not fit our newly elevated status." The audacity of her words hung in the warm air of the dining room. She was literally kicking me out into the freezing night to maintain a fake image of prosperity. She wore a diamond bracelet bought with massive credit card debt, while sneering at the very career that had actually funded the roof over her head. Jamal nodded along, pulling at his custom designer collar. "It is just business, Clara. We are playing in the big leagues now. We cannot afford dead weight." My mother. Patricia tapped her manicured fingernails against the edge of the mahogany table. The sound was sharp and impatient, echoing in the sudden silence of the room. "The keys, Clara," she demanded, aggressively extending her palm further across the table. "I need the basement keys, the front door keys, and the garage remote. Do not make me ask again." I stared at her outstretched hand. This was the woman who had brought me into the world. This was the family I had dutifully supported, the people I had tried so desperately to please for 3 decades. A heavy, suffocating pressure built in my chest, threatening to rise into my throat. The instinct to cry, to beg for a few days, to pack my entire life properly fought to take over, but I forced my jaw tight. I refused to shed a single tear for these people. I refused to give Audrey the satisfaction of seeing me break under their collective cruelty. I swallowed the lump in my throat, replacing my heartbreak with a wall of solid ice. The most agonizing part was not the eviction itself. It was the timing. The psychological betrayal of this exact moment hit me with breathtaking clarity. They had known about this fake corporate retreat for weeks. They had watched me buy the turkey, spend 2 days preparing the side dishes, and set the table for a beautiful family dinner. They waited until the meal was finished, until they had eaten the food I bought and cooked before springing their trap. They waited until 8 o'clock on Thanksgiving night, knowing full well that no moving companies were open, that banks were closed, and that finding a hotel in the city during a holiday weekend would be a complete logistical nightmare. They deliberately chose the exact moment I would be most vulnerable, most isolated, and most desperate. They wanted to inflict maximum damage to ensure I was too overwhelmed to fight back or demand my renovation money. My mother snapped her fingers, breaking my train of thought. The keys right now. I reached into my blazer pocket, pulled out the heavy brass keyring, and dropped it onto her pristine white tablecloth. It landed with a loud metallic clatter. "Thank you," she said, snatching them up quickly. "Now please see yourself out. We have a lot of cleaning to do before the real guests arrive." My father stood up from the head of the table, towering over me. He grabbed the handle of the black suitcase and shoved it toward the hallway. "Let us go," he commanded, marching toward the front entrance. I followed him in silence, my sensible flats clicking against the hardwood floors I had helped polish. He opened the heavy front door, and a blast of freezing Chicago wind whipped through the entryway. Without another word, he pushed my suitcase out onto the snow-covered porch. I stepped across the threshold, and he slammed the door shut behind me. The deadbolt clicked into place with a loud and final thud. I stood alone on the icy concrete, the bitter November wind cutting through my thin blazer. Snowflakes caught in my hair and melted against my cheeks. Any lesser person might have crumbled onto the frozen steps and surrendered to the sheer cruelty of the night. But standing there in the biting cold, something inside me fundamentally shifted. The desperate daughter seeking approval died on that porch. In her place, a cold, calculating survivor took over. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my bare fingers completely steady despite the freezing temperature. I did not look back at the brightly lit windows of the house where my family was undoubtedly toasting to their victory. I opened my local rideshare app and booked a premium car to the city center. Then, while waiting in the dark, I opened my banking app. I bypassed my daily checking accounts and scrolled directly to my secure investment portfolios. The numbers glowed brightly on the screen, displaying a net worth they could not possibly comprehend. They thought they had discarded a helpless corporate drone. They had no idea they had just declared war on a shark. The black SUV pulled up to the curb, its headlights cutting through the heavy snowfall. I loaded my single suitcase into the trunk and slid into the heated leather seat of the back seat. The driver offered a polite greeting, but I barely heard him. My mind was already compartmentalizing the shock, transforming raw betrayal into actionable data points. As the car pulled away from the manicured lawns of my childhood neighborhood, I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. I navigated past my personal investment portfolios and opened the portal for the shared family accounts. Years ago, when I first moved into the basement and agreed to pay substantial rent, I insisted on transparency. I set up a joint operating account specifically designated for property taxes, maintenance, and emergency repairs. Every month, I deposited my rent directly into this ledger, trusting my parents to manage the property expenses responsibly. I tapped the screen to view the current balance, expecting to see the comfortable cushion of reserve funds we had allegedly built up over the past 5 years. The page loaded. My breath caught in my throat. The balance was exactly zero. Not just low, but completely, entirely drained. A red negative sign flashed next to a pending overdraft fee from 3 days ago. My thumbs flew across the glass screen, pulling up the detailed transaction history for the last 12 months. The money I had meticulously transferred month after month had not gone to property taxes or roof repairs or plumbing maintenance. Instead, I saw a relentless stream of outgoing wire transfers. Large round numbers had been siphoned out with alarming frequency. $5,000 here, $10,000 there. The destination for every single one of these transfers was a corporate entity I recognized immediately. It was the holding company Jamal had registered for his highly publicized tech startup. My parents had systematically looted the household maintenance fund to finance the arrogant delusions of a man who spent his days trying on custom suits and posting motivational quotes online. My renovation money, my monthly rent, my emergency contributions, they had taken every last cent to play venture capitalist for a son-in-law who produced nothing of actual value. The depth of their financial deception was staggering, but my professional instincts told me this was only the surface level of the wreckage that I was about to uncover. I switched from the banking app to the web browser, immediately opening the Cook County Public Records database. In my daily corporate life, evaluating distressed assets and identifying toxic liabilities is second nature to me. Now I applied those exact same merciless analytical skills to my own flesh and blood. I typed my father's full legal name and the property address into the search bar. The digital vault opened instantly, laying bare the absolute reality of their financial situation. The primary mortgage document appeared exactly as I remembered it. But right beneath it sat an active, highly disturbing secondary lien. Richard and Patricia had quietly taken out a massive home equity line of credit 2 years ago, leveraging the entire value of the property, including the $150,000 in equity I had physically built with my extensive basement renovation. The principal balance withdrawn on that line of credit was a staggering $400,000. The dates of those massive bank withdrawals aligned perfectly with the timeline of Jamal launching his fraudulent cryptocurrency platform. My foolish parents had quite literally bet their entire family home on a smooth-talking charismatic grifter. The pieces of the puzzle locked together with sickening precision. My sister was not evicting me to make room for wealthy angel investors. Jamal did not have heavy-hitting venture capitalists flying in from New York to lease the property for a high-level corporate retreat. It was all a desperate, pathetic lie designed to protect their fragile egos and maintain an illusion of grandeur. The final crushing piece of evidence sat at the very top of the county records feed. It was a formal notice of default filed 30 days ago, followed swiftly by a lis pendens document. The bank had officially initiated legal proceedings. The property was already drowning in an active and unavoidable foreclosure. The so-called investors arriving tomorrow morning were not billionaires eager to fund a brilliant startup. They were aggressive cash buyers and property scavengers arriving to tour a distressed asset right before a short sale or a bank seizure. My parents had lost everything. They were bankrupt. Jamal had burned through $500,000 of their borrowed cash and generated zero revenue. And instead of coming to me, their daughter, who manages institutional wealth for a living, to ask for professional help, they chose cowardice. They chose to violently evict me on a freezing holiday night, to ensure I would be out of the way when the scavengers arrived to pick over the bones of our family home. They wanted to steal my equity, hide their catastrophic failure, and pretend they were rubbing shoulders with the elite right up until the bank officially changed the locks. I sat back against the leather seat of the car, the quiet hum of the heater contrasting sharply with the cold, hard truth staring back at me from my phone screen. They thought they had discarded a naive dependent. They thought I would simply disappear into the city and cry over their rejection. Instead, they had unwittingly handed me the exact blueprint of their total destruction. I locked my phone and looked out the window at the passing city lights. A cold quiet and absolutely ruthless clarity settled over me instantly, washing away any lingering trace of familial obligation. I realized in that precise second that I owed them absolutely nothing. They had drawn the battle lines clearly, and I was more than ready to fight back and claim what was rightfully mine, without a single drop of hesitation or remorse whatsoever. The SUV glided to a halt in front of a luxury downtown hotel. I stepped out into the biting wind and handed the valet my single black suitcase. Walking through the grand lobby, I felt absolutely nothing resembling grief or sorrow. There were no tears threatening to spill, and no lingering heartbreak over the family I had just lost. The emotional part of my brain had completely shut down, leaving only a razor-sharp, calculating focus. I approached the front desk and booked their premium corner suite for the week, handing over my corporate card with a steady hand. Once inside the room, I did not bother unpacking. I did not even take off my blazer. I walked straight to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the frozen Chicago skyline and pulled out my phone. It was almost midnight on Thanksgiving, but I knew exactly who to call. I dialed the private cell number of David, my 50-year-old real estate attorney. David is a brilliant, ruthless shark in the legal world who specializes in high-stakes commercial property litigation. He and I had navigated dozens of aggressive corporate acquisitions together over the past 4 years. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and alert despite the late hour. "Clara," he said, sounding slightly surprised, "I assume this is not a holiday greeting to wish me a pleasant turkey dinner. I need you to pull a residential property file right now, David," I told him, getting straight to the point. "My parents just evicted me from my basement suite and locked me out in the snow." I checked the county records from the back of my Uber. The house is in active foreclosure under a massive defaulted line of credit. I need the complete bank file, and I need to know exactly what kind of desperate exit strategy they are trying to pull off tomorrow morning. I heard the sound of a leather chair creaking, followed by the rapid clicking of a mechanical keyboard. "Give me the address," he replied, his tone instantly shifting into battle mode. "No questions about my well-being and no useless sympathy. This is exactly why I hired him." I rattled off the address of my childhood home. "Give me 10 minutes," he instructed. "I am tapping into the back-end registry now. I will call you right back shortly." David called back exactly 9 minutes later. I answered instantly, pressing the phone to my ear as I paced the length of the hotel suite. "You were right about the foreclosure, Clara," he began, his voice echoing with sharp professional precision. "But the situation is vastly more complicated and, frankly, far more sinister than a simple default. Your parents are not just losing the house. They are actively engaging in a coordinated financial fraud." I stopped pacing and stared out at the dark city lights below. "Explain the mechanics," I demanded. David sighed heavily. "The bank filed the notice of default 30 days ago, but your parents quickly countered by submitting an emergency short sale approval packet. They claimed severe financial hardship and petitioned the lender to accept a sale price drastically below the current market value of the property. They told the bank they found an independent cash buyer willing to close the deal immediately to save everyone the lengthy legal hassle of a formal foreclosure." I immediately saw the red flags. "Who is the buyer?" I asked, my mind racing through the possibilities. David let out a low, dark chuckle. "The buyer is listed as a newly formed limited liability company registered in Delaware, but tracing the registered agent leads directly back to a shell corporation managed by none other than your brother-in-law, Jamal. He is essentially buying the house from his own in-laws using unregulated private funds he likely scraped together from his other shady ventures." The entire scheme crystallized in my mind with horrifying clarity. A short sale to a friendly buyer. By convincing the bank to take a massive loss on the property, my parents would legally wipe away their crippling debt. But because the buyer was secretly Jamal, they would keep the physical house within the family. "It gets worse, Clara." David continued, his tone turning deadly serious. I pulled the preliminary settlement statement submitted to the bank. There is a secondary consulting fee built into the closing costs. Jamal arranged for a phantom management company to receive a massive payout at the closing table. He is funneling the bank's discounted loss straight back into his own pockets and kicking cash back to your parents under the table. They are wiping their financial slate clean and walking away with a huge stack of untraceable cash. "And my equity?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "The $150,000 I invested into that basement renovation. What happens to my specific financial stake?" David paused for a fraction of a second before delivering the final blow. "Your equity is completely vaporized, Clara. In a short sale, all secondary claims and undocumented investments are legally wiped out. They structured this entire fraudulent transaction to intentionally erase your financial contribution. They are literally stealing your renovation money to fund their illegal cash payout. Tomorrow morning at that closing meeting, they will sign the final documents and walk away wealthy while leaving you with absolutely nothing." I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. They had planned to rob me blind. They orchestrated this entire Thanksgiving eviction specifically to ensure I would be legally locked out of the property before the ink dried on their fraudulent settlement. My own sister and parents had conspired with a con artist to steal my hard-earned money and save their pathetic social status. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the cold logic of my profession take complete control. "David," I said, my voice echoing with pure, calculated resolve. "We are not going to let them close that deal. We are going to buy the debt." David went silent on the other end of the line for exactly 2 seconds before a slow chuckle escaped his lips. "You want to buy the paper?" he asked. "Yes," I replied, my voice unwavering. As a distressed asset manager, managing institutional wealth in Chicago, I deal with catastrophic financial failures every single day. I know exactly how the United States banking system operates behind closed doors. When average people think about mortgages, they picture a rigid, unyielding contract with a faceless mega bank. They assume the bank wants to keep their house. That is a complete myth. Banks absolutely hate owning physical real estate. A foreclosed house is a toxic liability that drains their resources, ruins their quarterly balance sheets, and requires massive legal fees to maintain. When a borrower stops paying their mortgage, the loan gets classified as a non-performing note, or an NPN in industry terms. At that point, the bank just wants the bleeding to stop. They want the bad debt off their ledgers immediately. This creates a massive lucrative loophole for anyone with enough liquid capital and the right connections. If you approach a lending institution and offer to buy their non-performing note in cash, they will gladly sell it to you at a steep discount. And here's the truly beautiful part of American financial law. When you purchase that debt, you do not just buy a piece of paper. You step entirely into the shoes of the original lender. You absorb all their legal rights and privileges. You acquire the direct collateral tied to the loan. You hold the deed of trust. You dictate the timeline. You literally become the bank. My parents and Jamal thought they were incredibly clever by orchestrating a fraudulent short sale. They assumed the original lender was too massive and bureaucratic to notice their coordinated scheme. They figured the bank would blindly accept their lowball offer just to clear the defaulted account before the end of the fiscal year. But they fundamentally misunderstood the vulnerability of their own plan. Until the final closing documents are signed and the ink is dry, that debt can be sold to a third party without their knowledge or consent. They were trying to steal my renovation equity by exploiting a banking system they barely understood. I was going to use my deep professional expertise to hijack their entire scam from the inside out. I instructed David to halt all his other cases and focus entirely on this precise acquisition. We had less than 72 hours before their scheduled short sale closing to legally intercept the loan and take total structural control of their financial destiny. I ended the telephone call and walked directly over to the glass desk inside my luxury hotel suite, calmly pulling out my laptop. It was finally time to ruthlessly gather all the necessary financial ammunition to effortlessly execute the corporate takeover of my family home tonight, without hesitation whatsoever, leaving absolutely nothing to chance. I opened my secure brokerage accounts, watching the digital dashboard load with absolute focus. For years, my family assumed my corporate salary barely covered my basement rent and basic living expenses. They relentlessly mocked my sensible lifestyle while they drowned themselves in designer debt to impress strangers. What they failed to realize was that I aggressively invested 60% of my income into diversified tech stocks and index funds. I navigated through the trading portal and began ruthlessly liquidating my secret portfolios. I sold off massive blocks of highly profitable shares, converting years of disciplined investments into immediate liquid cash. The transaction receipts flooded my inbox, confirming I possessed more than enough capital to purchase their defaulted mortgage outright. Next, I emailed David the necessary authorization forms to establish a brand new limited liability company in Delaware. We named the corporate entity Apex Holdings, LLC, to ensure my identity remained completely anonymous throughout the purchasing process. By the time the sun began rising over the frozen Chicago skyline, our corporate shell was legally active and ready to strike. The real challenge, however, was bypassing the standard bureaucratic red tape to reach the exact decision maker at their lending institution. Fortunately, working in distressed asset management on Wall Street means you know exactly who holds the keys. I scrolled through my professional contacts and found the direct office number for the senior portfolio manager at their specific bank. I called him the minute his office opened, leveraging my corporate title and our previous business dealings to secure an immediate negotiation. I presented a highly aggressive all-cash offer to purchase my parents' non-performing note, effectively bypassing the pending short sale entirely. I reminded him that Jamal and his fake startup investors could easily default at the closing table, leaving the bank holding a toxic asset for another 6 months. My offer guaranteed an instant risk-free cash injection to clean up his end-of-year ledger. The portfolio manager hesitated for barely a minute before recognizing the undeniable financial advantage of my proposal. He agreed to sell the debt to Apex Holdings at a remarkably steep discount, completely destroying the fraudulent short sale my parents had spent weeks orchestrating. The bank drafted the assignment of mortgage, transferring the full legal rights of the property loan directly into my anonymous corporate shell. I wired the liquid funds from my brokerage account, completing the transaction with clinical efficiency. By noon on Friday, the massive debt hanging over my childhood home belonged entirely to me. I closed my laptop and finally took a sip of cold coffee, allowing a brief, genuine smile to cross my face. My parents and Audrey were probably rushing around the house right now, polishing the hardwood floors and celebrating their impending financial rescue. They had absolutely no clue that the very daughter they had cruelly thrown into the street was now their sole legal creditor, holding total ultimate power over their pathetic futures, waiting patiently to strike back. Exactly 1 week passed since the freezing night my parents threw me onto the street. The digital clock on my hotel nightstand clicked to 8 in the evening when my phone screen illuminated with a rapid succession of incoming messages. I did not need to guess who was trying to reach me. It was Audrey. She sent a barrage of high-resolution photographs showcasing her latest attempt to manifest a luxurious reality. The images displayed a lavish dining table at one of Chicago's most exclusive Michelin star restaurants. Audrey was posing in a glittering designer dress, holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne. Beside her, Jamal flashed his signature arrogant smile, wearing a custom-tailored velvet dinner jacket. The final picture featured an absurdly expensive seafood tower and a receipt casually angled to display a total nearing $3,000. Beneath the obnoxious visual display, Audrey typed a lengthy paragraph dripping with pure venom and unearned superiority. She told me she felt a tiny bit of pity for my sad, lonely life. She specifically wrote that I must be freezing in whatever cheap studio apartment I had managed to rent with my pathetic corporate salary. She went on to boast about how Jamal and his brilliant mind had finally secured their financial future. According to her text message, the heavy-hitting investors were utterly obsessed with the house and had agreed to fund the startup with millions of dollars. She claimed the final closing meeting was scheduled for this upcoming Monday, and after that, the family would officially join the highest echelon of the Chicago elite. She ended the message by advising me to stay away from the neighborhood because my depressing energy would only drag down their newly elevated status. I read every single word of her delusional rant with absolute detachment. I did not feel a trace of anger or jealousy. I did not bother typing a reply to defend my current living situation or to point out the blatant absurdity of her claims. I simply locked my phone and placed it face down on the polished mahogany desk in front of me. Audrey thought she was celebrating a monumental victory, but she was actually toasting on the deck of a sinking ship. She had absolutely no idea that the very person she was attempting to humiliate was actively holding the deed to her entire fake empire now. I sat across from David in his law office reviewing printed financial documents. David had used his forensic accountants to pull every shred of bank activity tied to Jamal over the past 3 years. We mapped the exact trajectory of the stolen $400,000. What we discovered was pure fraud. "Look at this history," David said, sliding a folder across the desk. "Your brother-in-law spent nothing on software development. The tech startup does not exist. It is a hollow shell company registered to a virtual mailing address." I opened the folder and ran my finger down the itemized list of bank transfers. The audacity of his spending was genuinely staggering. The very first thing Jamal did after convincing my gullible parents to leverage their home equity was march into a luxury car dealership. He leased a brand new custom black Porsche under his fake corporate entity, using $70,000 of the borrowed funds as an immediate down payment. He classified the sports car as a necessary business vehicle to impress potential investors. But the car was merely the beginning of the financial hemorrhage. The vast majority of the missing funds had been aggressively funneled into offshore betting platforms and high-limit casino accounts. Jamal was a compulsive gambler disguising his massive losses as business expenses. I tracked the digital footprint linking the home equity line of credit directly to VIP accounts at casinos in Las Vegas and underground sports betting syndicates. He had spent the last 2 years systematically gambling away my renovation money and my parents' retirement security on poker tables and bad sports wagers. Whenever he lost a significant amount, he simply convinced my father to authorize another draw from the bank, claiming the startup needed more capital to clear a sudden regulatory hurdle. My parents were so blinded by their desperate desire to boast about having a tech genius in the family that they never once demanded to see an actual working product or a legitimate profit and loss statement. They just kept writing checks, blindly trusting a charismatic con artist who dressed well and spoke with unwarranted authority. He bled them completely dry, David observed, leaning back in his leather chair and steepling his fingers. And now that the well is empty, he is orchestrating this fraudulent short sale to cover his tracks. He plans to use the friendly buyer loophole to wipe out the remaining debt and legally steal the physical property right out from under your parents' noses. They are so incredibly foolish, they actually think he is rescuing them. They believe he is securing their wealthy status, when in reality he is preparing to leave them utterly destitute and homeless the second the paperwork clears. I looked at the glossy photo of the Porsche attached to the financial report and felt a surge of cold, clinical satisfaction. They chose to support a criminal over their own hardworking daughter, because a criminal offered them an illusion of status they craved. They traded their financial stability for a velvet dinner jacket and empty promises. "Well, David," I said, closing the manila folder with a decisive snap. "The illusion officially ends on Monday morning." I tapped my manicured fingernail against the cover of the dossier. "We have the absolute proof of their wire fraud, the evidence of his gambling addiction, and the complete legal ownership of their defaulted mortgage. Prepare the final documents, David. We are going to let them walk into that closing meeting believing they have won everything. And then we are going to drop the heavy iron anvil." The very next morning, my phone buzzed on the glass coffee table, breaking the quiet solitude of my hotel suite. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. A small part of my brain, the residual ghost of the dutiful daughter I used to be, wondered if she was calling to apologize. I wondered if the reality of throwing her child into the freezing snow had finally breached her thick wall of vanity. I picked up the device and accepted the call, remaining completely silent as I waited for her to speak first. Clara, her voice snapped through the speaker, crisp and entirely devoid of warmth. "I need you to transfer $400 to my account immediately." The audacity was so profoundly staggering that I actually pulled the phone away from my ear for a second, just to stare at it. There was no greeting whatsoever. There was no inquiry about my safety or whether I had frozen to death on the Chicago streets. There was only a ruthless financial demand delivered with the arrogant expectation of absolute compliance. I brought the phone back to my ear. "Why exactly would I transfer you $400? I asked, keeping my tone completely flat and analytical. "It is for the winter heating bill," my mother replied, her voice dripping with extreme impatience. "You used the basement heating system extensively during the first 3 weeks of November before you moved out. The utility company just sent the final statement for the month, and Jamal needs the household ledger to be perfectly balanced before the new corporate tenants arrive to take possession of the property. I expect you to cover your portion of the expenses today. You evicted me on Thanksgiving night, I reminded her, stating the objective fact, without a single ounce of emotion. You threw my suitcase out the front door and locked me out in the blizzard. And now you are calling me to collect a utility bill for a space I am no longer legally permitted to enter. You were not evicted, she scoffed loudly, offended by my accurate terminology. We simply reallocated the family resources to maximize our asset potential. Do not be so incredibly dramatic about a minor living adjustment. You lived under our roof for years, paying well below market rent while hoarding your corporate salary. You owe us for raising you, Clara. You owe us for the food you ate as a child and the sacrifices we made to provide you with a respectable upbringing. Paying this final heating bill is the absolute least you can do to repay the immense debt you owe this family. She was utterly delusional. She truly believed her own fabricated narrative where she was the benevolent matriarch and I was the ungrateful parasite. She stood inside a house that was actively in foreclosure, facing total financial ruin, while aggressively demanding $400 to satisfy a fake billionaire son-in-law. Her stunning arrogance blinded her to the catastrophic reality crashing down around her. She was rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic and demanding I pay for the privilege. I could have shattered her fantasy right then and there. I could have laughed and revealed that the heavy-hitting corporate investors touring the property tomorrow were actually liquidation agents preparing to seize her beloved house. I could have unleashed a torrent of righteous anger, rejecting her ridiculous $400 extortion attempt and demanding the return of my entire renovation investment. But working in distressed asset management teaches you an invaluable lesson about psychological warfare. Dangerous opponents never expose their hand prematurely. The lethal ones agree with you, feeding your ego while quietly removing the floor beneath your feet. I needed my mother and the rest of her greedy cohorts to feel absolutely victorious. I needed them to remain completely oblivious to the incoming corporate guillotine preparing to drop on their necks. If I fought back over a trivial heating bill, she might get suspicious. She might complain to Jamal, who might actually consult a competent attorney and discover that their debt had been quietly sold to my holding company. I could not risk compromising the ultimate destruction of their fraudulent short sale over a few $100s. I let a few seconds of silence stretch across the phone line, simulating the reluctant surrender of a defeated daughter. You are right, Mother, I said, my voice soft, compliant, and entirely hollow. I apologize for being dramatic about the living adjustment. I utilized the utilities, and it is only fair that I cover my share of the household expenses. I will wire the $400 directly into your primary checking account before noon today. The shift in her tone was instantaneous, reflecting her absolute triumph. I appreciate your maturity, Clara, she replied, her voice adopting that sickeningly sweet cadence she used when bragging to her country club friends. This is exactly why we need to maintain strict boundaries regarding family finances. Jamal works incredibly hard to secure these massive venture capital deals, and we must project an image of total stability and wealth. We simply cannot have petty internal squabbles disrupting our elite business transactions. Have a productive day at work, darling. She disconnected the call immediately without waiting for me to say goodbye. I lowered the phone and opened my banking application, completing the $400 transfer within seconds. I watched the confirmation screen flash green, signaling the money had arrived in her account. I felt a cold, sharp smile touch the corners of my mouth. She thought she had successfully disciplined her unruly, dependent daughter, extracting a final petty sum to assert her dominance. She had absolutely no idea that I gladly paid that minor fee simply to purchase her continued blindness. My compliance was a calculated narcotic, lulling her into a false sense of security. I wanted them blindly marching toward the closing table, completely intoxicated by their own arrogance. They were walking straight into my trap, perfectly unaware that the daughter they banished was the exact predator waiting in the shadows. My phone chimed with a LinkedIn notification. Jamal had just published a new video to his professional network. I clicked the alert and watched as his face filled my screen. He was standing in the grand entryway of my parents' house, wearing a brand new bespoke navy blue suit that clung perfectly to his broad shoulders. The crystal chandelier I had stared at during Thanksgiving dinner sparkled brightly above his head, perfectly framing his arrogant posture. He flashed $1 million smile, exuding the false confidence of a man detached from reality. "Welcome to the next chapter of the empire," he announced smoothly, walking through the living room like he owned the entire world. A true visionary never restricts himself to a single industry. Today, I am officially announcing our pivot from the tech sector into a massive $1 million real estate flip. We are transforming this luxury residential property into an exclusive high-yield corporate asset. I watched him gesture expansively toward the pristine hardwood floors and the custom molding. He leaned closer to the camera lens, lowering his voice to deliver his manufactured entrepreneurial wisdom. "You see, leveling up requires cutting dead weight," he preached, adjusting his designer silk tie. "You cannot elevate your net worth if you are surrounded by small-minded people. Some individuals are just genetically programmed to be corporate drones. They grind away in their miserable 9-to-5 cubicles, trading their precious hours for pennies. They lack the courage to disrupt the market, and they resent those of us who do. If you want to achieve elite financial status, you have to ruthlessly eliminate the employees in your life and surround yourself exclusively with bosses." The insult was aimed squarely and unmistakably at me. He was publicly celebrating my brutal eviction, masking his financial parasitism as some kind of genius business strategy. He was actively rebranding his fraudulent scheme to steal my money as a visionary real estate flip. I paused the video right on his smug, grinning face. He had meticulously crafted an illusion of success entirely funded by stolen equity and unpaid debts. He thought he was untouchable, broadcasting his fake triumphs to his network of equally fraudulent startup bros. I did not feel angry watching him strut through the house my money helped maintain. I simply closed the application and slid my phone into my leather handbag. His digital charade was the perfect documentation of his profound ignorance. He was busy filming motivational speeches for social media, while I was actively purchasing the ground beneath his custom Italian leather shoes. I grabbed my coat and left the hotel, walking briskly through the biting wind toward the financial district. David was already waiting for me when I stepped into his expansive corner office. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, sealing us inside the soundproof room. His massive glass desk was entirely clear, except for one thick stack of legal documents resting precisely in the center. "The wire transfer cleared an hour ago," David stated, his voice thrumming with professional satisfaction. "The lender received the funds and executed the transfer without a single question. They were ecstatic to get a toxic, non-performing asset off their books before the fiscal quarter ended." He slid the heavy stack of papers across the glass surface. I took a seat and pulled the documents toward me. The cover page bore the Cook County seal confirming the legal transfer. I picked up the heavy gold pen David offered and began signing my name on the designated lines. With every stroke of ink, I systematically dismantled my parents' fraudulent escape plan. I signed the transfer of the primary mortgage, securing my position as the primary creditor. I signed the assignment of the massive home equity line of credit, effectively acquiring the exact debt Jamal had used to fund his lavish lifestyle and offshore gambling habits. David watched me methodically execute the paperwork. "By establishing Apex Holdings, we shielded your identity," he explained, leaning forward. "Your parents and their fake buyer think they are still dealing with a faceless megabank. They have received zero notification that their debt was bundled and sold on the secondary market. As of this exact second, Clara, your limited liability company is the sole legal lien holder of the property." I flipped to the final document in the stack. It was the deed of trust. I stared at the legal description of the property, tracing the boundaries of the house where I had grown up, the house where I was told I did not belong. I signed the final page, making it official. I was no longer the unwanted daughter living in the basement. I was the absolute owner of their financial existence. "The trap is now fully armed," David said, gathering the executed documents and placing them into a secure red folder. Their scheduled short sale closing is set for Monday morning. They plan to walk into the title office sign, away their default, and walk out with their clean slates and their stolen cash. They believe they have successfully manipulated the banking system. I looked at the red folder containing the undeniable proof of my total victory. They are going to walk into that room expecting a rubber stamp from a tired bank representative. I replied, my voice sharp and cold. But the bank no longer owns their debt. We do, and we are going to attend that closing meeting in person. David smiled, a rare expression that signaled total legal annihilation. I will inform the closing agent that the new lien holder requires a face-to-face settlement, he confirmed. They will think it is just a final bureaucratic formality. I stood up from the leather chair, smoothing the front of my blazer. Jamal wanted to play the visionary real estate investor. My parents wanted to project an image of untouchable wealth. Audrey wanted to humiliate the corporate drone. On Monday morning, they were all going to learn exactly how the real financial world operates. The illusion was over and the reckoning was fully prepared. The fallout began less than 48 hours before the scheduled Monday morning closing. I was sitting at my hotel desk reviewing the final leverage documents when my phone buzzed with an encrypted message from David. Our quiet assignment of the mortgage had officially hit the county registry system. The shockwave reverberated through my family immediately. Jamal had structured his fraudulent short sale using a straw buyer represented by a remarkably shady local real estate attorney. That attorney, performing a routine title update before the weekend, discovered the sudden transfer of the debt from the massive megabank to Apex Holdings. Unregulated private equity firms like Apex do not simply rubber stamp heavily discounted short sales without initiating aggressive forensic audits of the buyer. The shady attorney instantly recognized the severe legal danger of attempting to push a fake transaction past a sophisticated private creditor. He immediately withdrew his representation and pulled the straw buyer from the deal entirely. The absolute panic that erupted inside my childhood home must have been magnificent to witness. I monitored the fallout through the digital footprint of their desperate actions. My parents' credit monitoring alerts, which I still had administrative access to view, showed 3 frantic inquiries for high-interest personal loans within a single hour. They were suddenly staring down the barrel of a catastrophic financial collapse. The short sale was dead. The megabank was gone. They were now in default to an unknown corporate entity that had paid cash for their debt and showed no signs of letting them walk away with their stolen equity. Jamal was undoubtedly pacing the hardwood floors, sweating through his custom-tailored velvet suit, trying to explain to my furious father why his brilliant millionaire investors had suddenly vanished into thin air. Without the short sale to magically erase the $400,000 line of credit, my parents faced an immediate, unmitigated foreclosure. A formal foreclosure meant a public auction. An auction meant total exposure of their financial ruin to their entire social circle. Every member of their elite country club would see their names listed in the county notices of default. Audrey would lose her perfectly curated aesthetic. Jamal would be exposed as a penniless fraud. My mother would be utterly humiliated beyond repair. Their carefully constructed illusion of wealth was evaporating right before their eyes, leaving them with absolutely nothing but crippling debt and impending homelessness. They were desperately searching for an escape hatch, completely unaware that I was the one controlling all the exits. I watched the frantic activity on their credit reports slowly die down as every single loan application was swiftly and predictably rejected by the lenders. They had hit a solid brick wall. Their options were entirely exhausted. The stage was set perfectly for the final phase of my operational strategy. I picked up my smartphone and immediately dialed David without any hesitation. "It is time," I told him. "Throw them the lifeline right now. Let us close this deal. Today." David executed the maneuver flawlessly from his private office exactly 1 hour later. Acting solely as the official corporate representative for Apex Holdings, he placed a direct telephone call to my father's personal cell phone. I remained on a muted conference line listening intently as the trap snapped completely shut. Mr. Richard David began, his voice carrying that chillingly polite corporate authority that immediately demands absolute submission. I am contacting you on behalf of Apex Holdings LLC. We recently acquired the non-performing note attached to your primary residence. Your secondary line of credit is currently in severe default, and your proposed short sale transaction has been formally denied. I could hear my father desperately gasp for breath on the other end of the line. The sheer terror in his voice was palpable as the reality of his total financial ruin washed over him. He attempted to argue, stammering out pathetic excuses about temporary cash flow problems and delayed venture capital investments. But David shut him down instantly. Apex Holdings is not interested in your excuses or your fabricated investment timelines, David stated flatly, slicing through my father's desperate bluster. You are facing a public foreclosure auction within the next 30 days. However, my client is willing to offer you a highly specific alternative to mitigate our own legal costs. We are offering you a deed in lieu of foreclosure. If you sign the physical property deed over to our holding company immediately, we will formally waive our right to pursue a deficiency judgment against your future assets. You will walk away with absolutely nothing, but you will avoid declaring total bankruptcy, and your public reputation will remain intact. My father went completely silent. A deed in lieu of foreclosure is essentially a financial surrender. You forfeit the house to the lender without a fight, saving both parties the gruesome spectacle of a courtroom battle. For a narcissist like my father, avoiding the public humiliation of a foreclosure auction was the ultimate priority. He could easily spin a quiet surrender to his country club friends, claiming they simply decided to downsize and sell to a private firm. David paused, letting the heavy weight of the ultimatum sink in. There is one non-negotiable condition, David continued coldly. The execution of these documents must be completed in person. You, your wife, and your secondary tenants will meet me in my downtown Chicago office this Monday morning at 9 sharp. If you refuse, we file the auction paperwork by noon. My father, completely panicked by the ticking clock, eagerly seized the bait. Yes, he practically begged into the receiver, his arrogant pride utterly demolished. We will absolutely be there on Monday morning. We will sign whatever your client requires. We agree to the terms. David hung up, disconnecting with a satisfying click. He unmuted my line. They took it, Clara, he said quietly. I smiled coldly. They thought they had outsmarted the banking system. They had no clue what awaited them there. 3 days before the scheduled Monday morning closing, my phone buzzed on my hotel desk. The caller identification displayed my sister, Audrey. I let it ring 3 times before sliding my finger across the glass screen. I wanted to hear exactly how she planned to spin their catastrophic financial surrender into a victory. Clara. She began, her tone dripping with that familiar suffocating condescension. I am calling to offer you an olive branch. Jamal and Dad just finalized a massive corporate buyout of the house. We are officially relocating to a luxury penthouse closer to the tech hub downtown. The new corporate owners are incredibly strict about the property handover conditions, and we want everything to be absolutely flawless for their arrival on Monday. I remained completely silent, allowing her to dig her grave deeper. Audrey sighed heavily into the receiver, adopting the voice of a weary benefactor forced to deal with a difficult charity case. Look, we know you are probably struggling right now, she continued. We know you are completely broke and living out of a suitcase somewhere. Jamal and I discussed it, and we decided to be generous. We are willing to pay you $1,000 in cash if you come back to the house this weekend and deep clean the entire property. The basement suite you occupied is completely filthy and needs to be scrubbed from top to bottom before the executives inspect it. The sheer magnitude of the insult was almost impressive. My sister was standing inside a home facing imminent bank seizure. She was preparing to forfeit all her possessions to avoid federal fraud charges. Yet her narcissistic delusion compelled her to call the sister she had ruthlessly evicted and offer her a degrading maid service job for a pathetic sum of cash. She wanted me on my hands and knees scrubbing hardwood floors with harsh chemicals just to stroke her own fragile ego one final time. Think of it as a lifeline, Clara, she urged, interpreting my continued silence as desperate consideration. $1,000 is a lot of money for someone in your precarious financial position. You can finally afford a decent motel room and maybe some new clothes for job interviews. Just show up tomorrow morning with cleaning supplies. We will leave the side door unlocked for you so you do not track dirty mud through the main foyer. I listened to her shallow breathing through the speaker, feeling absolutely no anger, resentment, or hurt. The emotional detachment I possessed was total and absolute. I did not feel the need to scream or correct her pathetic, fabricated narrative about a corporate buyout. I simply smiled a cold, sharp smile that she could not see. "That is an incredibly generous offer, Audrey," I replied, my voice echoing with a chillingly polite and measured cadence. "However, I am currently fully employed and my schedule is entirely booked for the weekend. I strongly suggest that you and Jamal purchase some heavy-duty sponges and scrub those basement floors yourselves. I happen to know on very good authority that the new corporate owners have exceptionally ruthless standards." Before she could utter another condescending syllable, I pressed the red button and ended the phone call immediately. I tossed the smartphone onto the sleek glass desk and stood up from my ergonomic leather chair. I walked slowly across the expansive hardwood floor of my temporary executive suite until I reached the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. I placed my palms flat against the cold, reinforced glass and looked out over the sprawling, magnificent grid of downtown Chicago. The winter sun reflected blindingly off the frozen steel and glass skyscrapers surrounding me. Hundreds of feet below, tiny cars crept along the congested avenues, resembling insignificant mechanical ants navigating a concrete maze. I stood high above the chaos, breathing in the crisp, filtered air of my premium corporate sanctuary. My family believed I was freezing in some damp alleyway, clutching their discarded suitcase and praying for a meager handout. They truly thought they were tossing me a few discarded crumbs from their lavish banquet table. They could not fathom that I was the predator circling their sinking ship, analyzing every single drop of blood they spilled into the water. I turned away from the breathtaking skyline and walked purposefully back to my desk. The heavy oak surface held only a few essential items: a sleek silver laptop, a cup of black coffee, and a thick red legal folder. I reached out and rested my fingertips lightly against the textured cardboard cover of that specific folder. Inside those pages lay the absolute totality of my family's financial execution. It held the legally binding assignment of mortgage, the defaulted home equity line of credit, the documentation of Jamal's offshore gambling transactions, and the unforgiving deed in lieu of foreclosure they had eagerly agreed to sign. It was a complete, airtight, unassailable financial death warrant, explicitly bearing my anonymous corporate seal. I picked up the heavy red folder, feeling the substantial physical weight of the glossy paper inside. I unzipped my structured designer leather briefcase and slid the documents carefully into the interior compartment, ensuring the edges remained perfectly pristine and unbent. I zipped the bag closed with a sharp, definitive metallic snap that echoed loudly in the quiet room. The preparation phase was officially complete. The psychological warfare had finally reached its absolute inevitable conclusion. There was nothing left to do but wait for the sun to rise on Monday morning. I checked my reflection in the dark glass of the window, carefully adjusting the lapels of my expertly tailored dark blazer. I took a deep breath, savoring the profound silence of the room and the undeniable power of knowing I held their future in my hands. They would soon learn that cruel actions have extremely severe financial consequences. I was ready to walk into that boardroom and permanently destroy their entire world with absolute precision. Monday morning arrived with a sharp chill cutting through the Chicago air, but inside the towering skyscraper of David's law firm, the temperature was perfectly controlled. The conference room sat on the 45th floor, projecting an atmosphere of absolute sterile intimidation. Solid oak paneling lined the expansive walls, absorbing the muted sounds of the bustling city below. A massive frosted glass table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by ergonomically perfect leather chairs. Sitting along one side of that massive table was my family. I observed them through the slightly parted blinds of the adjoining observation room before making my entrance. They looked exactly like people desperately trying to project an image of untouchable generational wealth. My father Richard wore a tailored charcoal suit that undoubtedly cost more than his monthly pension. He sat back with his legs casually crossed, radiating the false confidence of a man who firmly believed he had just outsmarted the entire United States banking system. My mother Patricia sat rigidly next to him, wearing a pristine cream-colored cashmere dress and clutching a designer handbag to her chest like a shield. Audrey and Jamal occupied the adjacent seats looking equally absurd. Jamal had worn his signature velvet dinner jacket despite it being 9:00 in the morning. He leaned over the glass table, laughing loudly and slapping his hand against the surface. Audrey was busy adjusting her diamond bracelets and reapplying a layer of expensive red lipstick using the reflection of her smartphone camera. They were actively celebrating their supposed genius. I could hear the muffled sounds of their arrogant conversation seeping through the heavy walls. Jamal was loudly bragging about how incredibly stupid the original lenders were for letting them walk away clean. He boasted about funneling the equity into a new offshore holding company, claiming this massive real estate maneuver would officially put them on the map. Audrey giggled loudly, agreeing with every delusional word he spoke. She leaned her head against his shoulder, praising his brilliant negotiation tactics. My mother smiled warmly at the two of them, offering her complete maternal approval for a man who had literally gambled away her retirement fund. My father nodded along, tapping his expensive gold watch against the glass table, checking the time with impatient anticipation. They genuinely thought they were sitting in a high-end corporate victory lap. They believed the anonymous private equity firm that bought their debt was simply going to stamp a few papers and absorb their massive financial failure. They were toasting to their escape, completely oblivious to the fact that they were currently sitting inside a meticulously crafted legal slaughterhouse. The sheer magnitude of their collective ignorance was almost breathtaking to witness. They were so blinded by their own greed and vanity that they never once stopped to question why an elite downtown law firm would actually handle a simple defaulted mortgage closing. They just assumed they deserved this level of prestige. I smiled a cold smile. At precisely 9:00, the heavy oak doors of the conference room swung open. David walked in first, projecting an aura of absolute legal authority. He wore a severe black suit, his posture rigid and commanding. He carried nothing but a single silver pen. I stepped into the room immediately behind him, holding the thick red legal folder firmly against my side. My dark structured blazer and perfectly pressed trousers mirrored his corporate intensity. The laughter in the room died instantly. The immediate shift in the atmosphere was palpable as 4 pairs of eyes locked onto my face. The sheer confusion radiating from my family was incredible. They did not process the reality of the situation. Instead, their deeply ingrained prejudice provided them with a wildly alternative narrative. They immediately assumed I was completely destitute and had somehow tracked them down to beg for financial assistance. My father dropped his hand from the table, his face twisting into a scowl of deep, profound annoyance. "Clara, what on earth are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice echoing loudly in the sterile room. "How did you even know we were having a meeting at this office building?" Audrey let out a loud, dramatic sigh and rolled her eyes toward the ceiling. "Oh my God," she groaned, crossing her arms over her chest. "Did you seriously follow the lawyers here to ask us for a handout? We told you on Thanksgiving that we are completely done supporting you." Jamal let out a booming, arrogant laugh, leaning back in his expensive leather chair and pointing a manicured finger at me. "Look at this corporate drone," he mocked, shaking his head. "You really cannot take a hint, can you? We are in the middle of a multi-million-dollar corporate transaction. You cannot just barge into a private executive meeting hoping to secure a quick loan. We are playing in the big leagues now." My mother, Patricia, clutched her handbag tighter, looking at David with an expression of performative embarrassment. "I am so incredibly sorry for this intrusion, sir," she said, attempting to sound like a sophisticated socialite handling a minor inconvenience. "This is my estranged daughter. She has been struggling recently and tends to be a bit dramatic. Please have your security team escort her out so we can finalize our paperwork with your firm." I did not react to a single word they said. I did not flinch at the insults or their pathetic attempts to humiliate me in front of a senior attorney. I simply walked forward, moving with deliberate, measured steps until I reached the head of the frosted glass table. I stood directly opposite my father, holding the red folder with absolute stillness. David did not call for security. He did not ask me to leave. He simply stood beside me, maintaining his strict professional silence, allowing them to dig their own graves with their remarkable arrogance. The trap was perfectly sprung, and they were caught without knowing. "Wait." Jamal practically barked the word, throwing his hands up in a theatrical display of disbelief. He leaned his elbows heavily onto the frosted glass table and let out a booming, arrogant laugh that echoed off the oak-paneled walls. He shook his head side to side, looking at me with pure, unadulterated pity. "Did you actually follow the lawyers here to ask for a handout, Clara? Are you that desperate?" He adjusted the cuffs of his velvet dinner jacket, shooting a conspiratorial smirk toward Audrey. "I mean, I knew you were struggling after we had to kick you out of the basement, but stalking legal professionals across downtown Chicago to crash a closed-door corporate settlement is a new low even for you." Audrey giggled behind her hand, her diamond bracelets clinking together. "She probably thought you were hiring assistants, David," she said, addressing my attorney as if they were old friends at a country club mixer. "You should really tell your lobby security to be more thorough. We cannot have desperate people wandering into private financial meetings. It is incredibly unprofessional." My father, Richard, slammed his palm flat against the table. The sharp sound made my mother jump slightly in her cashmere dress. He glared at me with absolute contempt, his face flushing an angry red. "Clara, you have crossed a massive line today," he warned, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "I told you on Thanksgiving that you are no longer welcome to disrupt our lives. You do not belong in this room. You do not belong in this tier of business. We are executing a highly sensitive real estate transaction that requires absolute discretion, and you are standing here looking like a lost intern." He quickly turned his attention to David, desperately trying to salvage his perceived image of high-class wealth. "Mr. David, I must deeply apologize for this highly irregular disruption. We apologize for my estranged daughter's intrusion today. She has a habit of inserting herself into situations where she simply does not belong. She is entirely cut off from our family finances, and she has absolutely zero legal standing to be present at this closing table. Please call your security personnel immediately and have her physically removed from the premises so we can get down to business. We have a lunch booked at noon and prefer not to waste another minute dealing with her." David did not call for security. He did not reach for the phone on the center of the conference table. He did not even acknowledge my father's frantic apology or Jamal's booming laughter. Instead, David simply maintained total, absolute professional silence. He stood completely still, his posture perfectly rigid, his expression chiseled out of pure granite. The cold, deadpan look in his eyes was something I had seen him use 100 times in brutal corporate litigation. It was a calculated psychological weapon designed to let arrogant people dig their own graves as deeply as possible before throwing them in. My family took his silence as an invitation to keep speaking. Jamal chuckled again, leaning back and crossing his arms. "Look, man, we get it," Jamal told David, adopting a falsely empathetic tone. "Family can be messy. Sometimes you have to trim the dead branches to let the healthy ones grow right. We trimmed her. Now let us sign these papers and get this cash finalized." David completely ignored him. He did not offer a single word of confirmation or agreement. He simply reached out and took the heavy red legal folder from my hands. He placed it squarely in the center of the frosted glass table. The heavy cardboard hit the surface with a dull, definitive thud, that temporarily halted my mother's nervous whispering. David methodically unsnapped the metal closure. He moved with agonizing precision, deliberately slowing down his actions to command the entire gravity of the room. He extracted the first stack of documents which contained the original defaulted home equity line of credit. He placed it precisely in front of my father, aligning the edges with the border of the glass table. Richard looked down at the paper, his brow furrowing in slight confusion, but he remained quiet, assuming this was standard procedure. Next, David pulled out the heavily audited tracking sheets detailing Jamal's offshore gambling transactions and the lease agreement for the custom black Porsche. He placed those documents squarely in front of Jamal. Jamal glanced at the top page, and his arrogant smile faltered for a fraction of a second, though he quickly masked it with a confused scoff. Audrey leaned over to look, but David was already pulling out the next file. He retrieved the massive assignment of mortgage, the official county-sealed paperwork, proving the massive megabank no longer held their debt. He laid it gently in front of my mother Patricia, who stared at the complex legal jargon with blank, uncomprehending eyes. Finally, David extracted the deed in lieu of foreclosure, the absolute surrender document. He placed it directly in the center of the table alongside his silver pen. Throughout this entire process, David never broke his silence. He never offered a comforting explanation or a polite disclaimer. He just kept arranging the papers like a mortician preparing surgical tools. The loud, arrogant energy that had filled the room began to rapidly evaporate. The suffocating weight of David's silence began sucking the oxygen out of their lungs. My father tugged at his expensive silk tie, suddenly looking very warm. Jamal shifted uncomfortably in his velvet jacket, his eyes darting frantically between the gambling records and David's stoic face. They had walked in expecting a celebratory transaction with a subservient bank representative. Instead, they were sitting in a freezing room with a man treating them like condemned prisoners. The silence stretched on for 10 seconds. They were drowning in the quiet realization that something was deeply wrong with this meeting, but their egos prevented them from understanding the true nature of their impending execution. The agonizing silence stretched until the air in the room felt too heavy to breathe. My father shifted in his expensive leather chair, clearly unable to handle the psychological pressure any longer. He reached out and tapped the glossy cover of the foreclosure document with his index finger. "Look here." He started, his voice attempting to regain its previous arrogant authority. "We were told this was a standard closing meeting for our short sale. We are ready to sign the property over to the new investors and finalize the payout structure Jamal negotiated. There is absolutely no need for all these extra files and theatrical delays. Let us simply execute the primary transfer and get this over with." David finally raised his head. He looked directly at my father with eyes as cold as a frozen lake. He did not blink. He did not smile. He simply folded his hands together, resting them gently on the frosted glass table. "I believe there has been a fundamental misunderstanding regarding the exact nature of my presence here today," David said, his voice perfectly modulated and razor-sharp. It sliced through the room with devastating clarity. "You walked into this firm assuming I was a low-level bank representative tasked with rubber-stamping a fraudulent real estate transaction. You believed you were dealing with a faceless megabank eager to write off a bad debt." He paused, letting his words hang in the sterile air. "Let me be absolutely clear, Richard. I am not the buyer. I am not a bank representative. I am merely the legal counsel. My firm was retained exclusively to facilitate the corporate acquisition of your defaulted loans on the secondary market. We do not negotiate with debtors. We simply execute the demands of our client." David turned his head slightly and extended his right hand toward me. He looked back at my father and delivered the absolute crushing blow. "Allow me to introduce the Chief Executive Officer and sole owner of Apex Holdings, LLC." David announced, his voice ringing with undeniable power. "She holds your primary mortgage. She holds your heavily defaulted home equity line of credit. And as of this exact second, she holds your entire financial future in her hands." Jamal's arrogant smile vanished, instantly wiped from his face, as if struck by a physical force. His jaw went slack, and his eyes widened in absolute terror as he stared down at the gambling records David had placed in front of him. My father, Richard, dropped his heavy gold pen. It hit the frosted glass table with a sharp clatter and rolled away, falling onto the carpeted floor. All the color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He looked at me, his eyes darting frantically, searching for any sign that this was a terrible joke. My mother, Patricia, let out a loud, dramatic gasp, pressing both her hands against her chest. Her cashmere dress suddenly seemed too tight for her to breathe. She slumped back against her leather chair, completely paralyzed by the revelation. Audrey simply froze, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a fish out of water. Her fingers released her diamond bracelet and fell limply into her lap. I remained still, sitting at the head of the table. The cold professional detachment I had honed over the past week served as my greatest weapon. I looked at the four people who had discarded me in the snow. The compliant daughter, who had quietly paid their bills and endured their insults, was completely gone. In her place sat an apex predator who had just legally purchased their complete financial destruction. "You thought you were conducting a brilliant business maneuver," I said, my voice steady and entirely emotionless. "You thought you could orchestrate a fraudulent short sale, wipe away your massive debt, and walk away with cash while actively stealing the $150,000 I invested into your basement. You genuinely believed the banking system was too massive to notice your petty theft. But the banking system is not a faceless entity. It is a network of skilled professionals who eliminate toxic liabilities. I happen to be one of those professionals. When you evicted me on Thanksgiving night, you handed me the exact motivation I needed to investigate your public records. I liquidated my personal investment portfolios and bought your defaulted loans directly from your lender with cold hard cash." Jamal began to visibly sweat. Beads of moisture formed on his forehead as he finally understood the severity of his situation. He reached out with trembling fingers and touched the stack of papers detailing his offshore gambling habits. "You tracked my transfers?" he whispered, his voice cracking with fear. "I tracked everything," I replied, keeping my gaze locked on his panicked face. "I tracked the $70,000 down payment you made on your leased sports car. I tracked the hundreds of thousands of dollars you funneled into illegal sports betting syndicates. Your tech startup does not exist, Jamal. You are a complete fraud, and you dragged my foolish parents down with you." My father tried to speak but failed. He swallowed hard, his arrogant posture completely crumbling under the weight of his colossal failure. He finally realized that the anonymous corporate entity demanding an in-person settlement meeting was never going to offer them a clean escape. The deed in lieu of foreclosure, sitting in the center of the table, was not a lifeline. It was a legally binding surrender document drafted by his own daughter. Patricia let out a quiet, whimpering sound, her eyes filling with terrified tears. They were entirely trapped inside a soundproof room with the one person they had ruthlessly underestimated their entire lives. The power dynamic had shifted so violently and absolutely that the atmosphere in the room felt entirely different. They were no longer the wealthy elite holding court. They were desperate debtors staring at their absolute ruin. Total silence consumed the expansive conference room. It was not just the absence of speech, but a heavy, suffocating void that seemed to press against their throats. The ventilation system hummed quietly overhead, becoming the only audible sound in the space. I sat perfectly upright at the head of the frosted glass table, claiming my position of absolute authority. My parents and my sister remained frozen in their luxury clothing, looking entirely ridiculous now that their facade had been violently ripped away. I reached out and pulled the thick red folder closer to me. The bright crimson cover starkly contrasted with the pristine table surface. I unsnapped the metal closure with a sharp click that made my sister Audrey physically flinch. I deliberately did not rush. I let the agonizing anticipation build, ensuring they felt every single second of their impending financial execution. I extracted the first stack of high-resolution color copies. These were the primary mortgage default documents, complete with the aggressive late payment histories and the official bank seals. I slid them firmly across the glass, directly toward my father. He silently stared at the bold red ink stamping his complete financial failure into the permanent public record. Next, I calmly pulled out the heavy secondary file. It was a remarkably thick stack of paper detailing the entire transaction history of their home equity line of credit. I pushed it toward my mother, watching her manicured hands tremble as they hovered over the pages. Then I turned my attention to Jamal. I selected the custom-printed dossier David had prepared specifically for this exact moment. I spread the pages out, fanning them across the table, like a dealer revealing a losing hand of cards. The top document was the official dealership lease agreement for his custom black Porsche bearing his signature and the $70,000 down payment sourced directly from my parents' leveraged house. Right beside it, I placed the irrefutable ledgers from the offshore betting syndicates and high-limit casino accounts. The spreadsheets highlighted massive weekly deposits and catastrophic losses, displaying a pattern of reckless, compulsive gambling. The physical evidence of their collective delusion now covered the entire center of the conference table. There was no room left for denial or spin. They could not blame the economy or predatory lenders. The paperwork clearly outlined a deliberate, coordinated effort to fund a fraudulent lifestyle using borrowed money they had absolutely no intention or ability to repay. My father finally tore his eyes away from the default notices and looked at me. His arrogant posture had completely collapsed, leaving him hunched forward like a defeated old man. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer another pathetic excuse or a desperate plea for leniency, but I raised my bare hand, silencing him instantly. It was my turn to speak, and I intended to ruthlessly dissect every single fabricated lie they had ever told right here and right now without showing a single ounce of mercy. "You stole from me!" I began, my voice slicing through the heavy air with surgical precision. "You did not just make a poor real estate investment or fall victim to a fluctuating market. You actively and maliciously stole the $150,000 I personally invested into your basement. You literally stole my home equity to finance a completely fabricated fake existence." I pointed a steady finger at Jamal, who was currently sweating through his velvet jacket. "You paraded around country clubs and posted flashy motivational videos on social media pretending to be a brilliant tech visionary. But there is no startup. There are no heavy-hitting angel investors from New York. There is only a compulsive gambler burning through borrowed cash on offshore poker sites while driving a leased Porsche he cannot actually afford." I shifted my gaze to my sister Audrey, whose red lipstick now looked like a painted clown smile against her incredibly pale skin. "You called me a corporate drone, Audrey. You said my practical lifestyle ruined your elite aesthetic. Yet my reliable paycheck was the only real money flowing into that house. While you were sipping vintage champagne at Michelin star restaurants and mocking my sensible career, you were literally drinking the equity I built with my own two hands. You were playing dress-up with stolen funds." I then looked directly at my parents, watching them shrink under my unrelenting scrutiny. "You desperately wanted to impress your wealthy friends," I told them, maintaining my cold, clinical tone. "You wanted to project an image of untouchable generational prosperity so badly that you willingly sacrificed your own daughter. You leveraged your entire home, dragging yourselves into insurmountable debt, just to maintain a pathetic illusion of grandeur. When the money finally ran out, you orchestrated a fraudulent short sale. You tried to secretly wipe away the debt and keep the house by using Jamal as a fake buyer. You planned to completely erase my financial contribution and leave me with absolutely nothing. You orchestrated that cruel Thanksgiving eviction strictly to ensure I would be legally locked out before the final paperwork was signed. You justified your greed by telling yourselves I was just a burden who owed you for my childhood. The absolute truth is that you are all financially illiterate cowards playing a dangerous game of pretend. Every single boast you made to your friends, every luxury purchase, and every arrogant display of wealth was entirely built on a massive foundation of lies and systemic fraud. You traded your long-term security for temporary validation from strangers who do not even care about you. Now the illusion you worked so hard to build is completely and entirely shattered forever. I leaned forward, resting my hands heavily on the frosted glass table, looking at their defeated faces. I am not the naive, dependent daughter you so cruelly threw into the freezing snow. I am the institution holding your debt, and your fake empire is officially dismantled right here and today. The suffocating weight of my declaration finally broke through their thick layers of delusion. Pure, unadulterated panic rapidly replaced the stunned silence in the conference room. My mother, Patricia, let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest as her perfectly constructed world shattered into millions of jagged pieces. Audrey squeezed her eyes shut violently, shaking her head from side to side as if trying to physically eject the terrifying reality from her brain. Jamal simply stared blankly at the gambling ledgers, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths, as the federal implications of his massive fraud became entirely undeniable. But it was my father, Richard, who reacted with the most volatile and predictable explosion of narcissistic rage. He could not accept being defeated by the daughter he had always deemed inferior. He pushed his heavy leather chair back with a violent shove that sent it crashing into the oak-paneled wall behind him. He stood up to his full height, planting both his hands firmly on the frosted glass table, and leaned forward, attempting to cast an intimidating shadow over me. Clara, he barked, his voice rising to that familiar booming volume he used whenever he wanted to crush my spirit into total submission. This little revenge stunt of yours ends right now. You are going to take these ridiculous documents and you are going to tear them up immediately. Do you hear me? You are going to call off this absurd corporate takeover and cancel this debt today. I looked up at him, completely unfazed by his aggressive posturing. He was trying to summon the terrifying patriarch of my childhood, but all I saw was a desperate, bankrupt man, wearing a suit he could no longer afford. You do not get to walk into a room and dictate terms to us, he continued, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. We are not some anonymous debtors on your corporate spreadsheet. We are your parents. I am your father. I put the roof over your head. I paid for the food you ate. We are your blood, Clara, and you owe us absolute respect. You do not get to orchestrate a financial hostile takeover against your own flesh and blood simply because you are upset about a minor housing disagreement. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, his desperation bleeding through his aggressive facade. You will execute a full release of this lien right here and right now. You will forgive the entire balance of the home equity line of credit, and you will allow Jamal to proceed with his business strategies as we originally planned. Family protects family. We raise our own up when they need help. We do not throw them to the wolves over petty grievances. You owe this family your loyalty, and I demand that you show us the respect we fundamentally deserve. He stood there panting slightly, expecting his authoritarian command to force my immediate compliance, just as it always had when I was a terrified teenager living under his roof. He truly believed that invoking the sacred bond of blood would somehow magically erase his catastrophic financial crimes and his unforgivable cruelty. He thought the title of father granted him absolute immunity from the brutal consequences of his own disastrous actions. I remained seated, watching his chest heave with self-righteous indignation. The sheer audacity required to demand blind loyalty after abandoning me in the freezing snow was truly a spectacular display of staggering parental narcissism. His face remained twisted in absolute arrogant expectation, fully demanding my total surrender to his fake authority. I did not raise my voice or break my intense, unyielding eye contact. The profound silence returned to the conference room, amplifying the sheer futility of his outburst. I slowly stood up from the head of the glass table, mirroring his physical height, but exuding a vastly different kind of power. I did not need to scream to establish dominance. I held the absolute legal and financial leverage. You are completely, entirely wrong, I replied, my words dropping like heavy stones into the quiet space. Respect is an earned currency. And you bankrupted your account long before you drained your financial one. I picked up the red legal folder, holding it out toward him. I am not throwing you to the wolves, Richard. You actively invited the wolves into your home when you let a con artist gamble away your retirement. I simply bought the deed to the forest. My father opened his mouth, his lips trembling, but no sound emerged. The fabricated authority he relied upon had completely evaporated, leaving him utterly defenseless. Do you remember what you told me on Thanksgiving night? I asked, stepping closer to the edge of the table. You stood over me while I was holding a packed suitcase. You looked me dead in the eyes, and you told me, this house was never yours anyway. I let those exact words hang in the air, ensuring every single person in the room absorbed their full, devastating weight. You were absolutely right, Richard. I continued delivering the final lethal blow with mechanical precision. This house was never mine. But right now, it is the exclusive property of my corporate entity. I own the walls, the foundation, the custom chandelier you bought on credit, and the very floor you are standing on. You are no longer my family. You are merely defaulting tenants, currently occupying my real estate without a valid lease agreement. Blood does not magically cancel out a signed mortgage contract, and biological relation does not offer legal immunity from federal wire fraud. I tapped the thick stack of foreclosure documents lying directly in front of his trembling hands. You evicted me to save your precious social status. Now I am foreclosing on you to secure my financial assets. This is not a petty family disagreement. This is simply a highly routine corporate liquidation, and your time has officially expired. We are completely done here. The sharp finality of my words hung in the sterile air for only a fraction of a second, before the illusion of high society manners completely shattered. Jamal violently shoved his ergonomic leather chair backward, sending it rolling aggressively into the solid oak paneling. He stood up to his full impressive height, his broad shoulders completely tensing beneath his custom-tailored velvet dinner jacket. His carefully curated aesthetic of a relaxed millionaire tech founder dissolved instantly, leaving nothing but a desperate, cornered predator lashing out at the nearest threat. He slammed both of his large hands flat against the frosted glass table, causing the heavy surface to physically vibrate under the sudden impact. "You think you are so incredibly smart, Clara?" He roared, his voice echoing aggressively throughout the confined space of the conference room. "You think you can just walk in here and orchestrate some kind of illegal setup to steal my legitimate real estate deal? You are completely delusional." He marched around the edge of the large table, intentionally invading my personal space, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me into backing down. The heavy scent of his expensive designer cologne washed over me, clashing sickeningly with the sour smell of his nervous sweat. "You hacked into my private financial records," he accused, jabbing a manicured finger directly toward my face. "You illegally accessed my proprietary corporate banking statements and used that stolen information to sabotage my massive venture capital funding. This entire presentation is nothing but blatant entrapment orchestrated by a jealous, bitter corporate drone who cannot handle watching her own family achieve absolute elite status. You have always been insanely jealous of Audrey and me. You resented our luxury lifestyle and our high-level networking connections." He leaned closer, his eyes wide with a frantic, wild energy as he desperately tried to rewrite the catastrophic reality of his situation. "I am a legitimate businessman, Clara. I have a massive network of powerful investors who will absolutely bury your pathetic little holding company in endless litigation. We are going to counter-sue you for corporate espionage and intentional interference with a highly lucrative business contract. You are going to lose everything you have ever worked for, and you are going to end up exactly where you belong, which is absolutely nowhere." He was breathing heavily now, spitting out his baseless legal threats with furious desperation. He actually believed that if he yelled loudly enough and threw around enough aggressive business buzzwords, he could somehow magically invalidate the ironclad foreclosure documents resting on the table. He thought he could bully his way out of a total financial execution just by acting like the smartest, most powerful man in the room. I did not step back. I did not flinch or break eye contact with him for a single second. I stood my ground, completely unmoved by his pathetic display of false masculine authority. Before Jamal could take another aggressive step forward, David smoothly intervened. My attorney did not raise his voice or match Jamal's frantic energy. He simply reached into the interior pocket of his tailored suit jacket and extracted a single crisp sheet of heavy legal paper. He stepped seamlessly between Jamal and myself, moving with the quiet, lethal grace of a seasoned corporate executioner. I highly suggest you lower your voice and return to your designated seat immediately. Jamal. David stated his tone, dropping to a chillingly calm baritone that commanded absolute, unquestionable obedience. You are currently in no position to threaten anyone with litigation. David placed the single sheet of paper onto the glass table and slid it precisely across the smooth surface until it stopped directly in front of Jamal's clenched fists. It was not a foreclosure notice or a civil lawsuit draft. It was a formal, meticulously detailed draft of federal criminal charges. I strongly advise you to read the heading on that document, David continued, crossing his arms over his chest. That is a preliminary filing for federal wire fraud. When you convinced your in-laws to extract $400,000 from a federally insured home equity line of credit and subsequently transferred those specific funds across state lines to unregulated offshore gambling syndicates in Las Vegas, you crossed a massive, insurmountable legal threshold. You did not just make a poor business decision, Jamal. You actively engaged in a systematic multi-state financial crime. The Federal Bureau of Investigation takes a remarkably harsh stance on individuals who utilize interstate wire transfers to launder stolen real estate equity. If you do not execute the deed surrender today, my firm will submit this exact document to the United States Attorney's Office by tomorrow morning. Jamal stared down at the crisp white paper. His eyes darted across the bold legal phrasing, absorbing the terrifying reality of his actions. He saw the specific federal statutes, listed the undeniable tracking of his casino deposits, and the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines printed clearly at the bottom. The arrogant, aggressive tech founder vanished completely. The sheer terror of federal prison drained every single ounce of fight left in his body. His knees physically buckled under the immense weight of the absolute truth. Jamal collapsed backward, falling heavily into his leather chair like a puppet whose strings had been abruptly severed. He stared at the frosted glass, his chest heaving, his perfectly styled velvet jacket suddenly looking like a ridiculous clown costume. He was utterly, entirely broken. Without a single moment of hesitation, the desperate, cornered man immediately turned on his own wife. It was her idea, he gasped, his voice cracking as he pointed a shaking finger directly at Audrey. She dragged me into this massive scam. She demanded the luxury lifestyle and the expensive dinners to impress her pathetic friends at the club. She made me pretend we were wealthy to compete with everyone else. I never wanted to do any of this. You need to blame her, Clara, entirely. Audrey sat frozen for a long, agonizing moment as her husband's treacherous words hung in the sterile air of the conference room. The man she had endlessly bragged about, the supposedly brilliant tech visionary she had used to humiliate me, had just thrown her directly to the federal wolves to save his own skin. Her meticulously crafted illusion of high society dominance evaporated instantly, leaving a pathetic, terrified woman staring at the wreckage of her entire existence. She had built her identity on being better than me, and now the man who funded that identity was openly abandoning her to face the consequences alone. The shock mutated quickly into pure, unadulterated panic. Audrey let out a piercing, guttural sob that echoed violently against the oak-paneled walls. Her perfectly manicured hands flew to her face, smearing her expensive red lipstick across her pale cheeks. She looked wildly at Jamal, who aggressively avoided her gaze, staring intently at his lap. She looked at our parents, who were too consumed by their own impending bankruptcy to offer her any protection. The undisputed golden child of the family suddenly realized she was completely and utterly alone, without a single safety net to break her catastrophic fall. She lunged forward, practically throwing her upper body across the frosted glass table. Her diamond bracelet scraped harshly against the surface as she desperately reached out and grabbed my hand with a crushing, frantic grip. Her fingers were freezing cold and slick with nervous sweat. "Clara, please," she wailed, her voice pitching into a hysterical, breathless shriek. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot do this to me. Jamal is lying to save himself. I never forced him to steal anything. I just wanted us to be successful. I just wanted Mom and Dad to be proud of us." Tears streamed heavily down her face, ruining her flawless makeup and dripping onto the expensive legal documents scattered across the table. "Big sister, please," she begged, using a term of endearment she had not spoken since we were children. "I am so incredibly sorry. I was stupid and vain, and I got caught up in the luxury lifestyle. But we are blood. We grew up together. You are my big sister, and I need you to protect me right now. I will do anything you want, Clara. I will apologize every single day for the rest of my life. I will scrub those basement floors just like I joked about. I will get a minimum wage job and pay you back every single cent we took. Just please do not take the house and do not let David send those federal fraud papers to the authorities. I am begging you to show us mercy." She was physically trembling, her nails digging desperately into my skin, trying to squeeze a drop of familial sympathy from a well she had personally poisoned and sealed shut years ago. I looked down at her shaking hands gripping mine. I felt absolutely no emotional response to her hysterical sobbing. The desperate pleas of the golden child fell entirely on deaf ears. I slowly and deliberately pulled my hand away from her frantic grasp, breaking the physical contact with clinical precision. I sat back in my leather chair, smoothing the cuff of my dark blazer, maintaining a posture of total, unwavering authority. "There is no big sister sitting at this table, Audrey," I replied, my voice dropping to a chillingly calm and measured register. "There is only the chief executive officer of the private equity firm that officially owns your entire financial existence. You do not get to invoke childhood memories or blood relation to escape the brutal consequences of your adult actions." I watched her wipe her ruined face, her eyes wide with terror as she realized her groveling was completely ineffective. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the glass table directly over the foreclosure documents. "Let us take a quick trip down memory lane." I continued, staring directly into her panicked eyes. "Think back to Thanksgiving night exactly a week and a half ago. It was snowing heavily. The wind chill was well below freezing. I had just finished cooking a holiday meal for this entire family. You sat in that dining room wearing a silk designer dress purchased with my stolen equity. You looked me up and down, and you slid a pre-packed black suitcase across the hardwood floor. Do you remember the exact words you used when you kicked me out into the winter storm?" Audrey whimpered softly, wrapping her arms around her own torso, as if trying to physically shield herself from the impending verbal execution. I remember every single syllable I stated, refusing to let her look away from me. "You called me a corporate drone. You said my boring 9-to-5 lifestyle was a massive liability to your luxury brand. You claimed that my mere presence in the basement ruined your wealthy aesthetic and dragged down your elite status. You smiled a vicious, arrogant smile as you watched Dad lock the heavy front door behind me, leaving me alone on the icy concrete. You felt no mercy for me then, Audrey. You felt absolute triumph. You celebrated my eviction because you thought it secured your fake millionaire playground." I gestured toward the devastating pile of bank records and federal fraud drafts spread across the table. "You are only crying right now because you got caught trying to cheat the system. You are not sorry that you stole my renovation money. You are only sorry that your fraudulent short sale failed and you are going out completely broke. You made a calculated decision to trade your sister for a velvet dinner jacket and a leased Porsche. Now you get to experience the exact same cold, hard reality you so gladly forced upon me." I tapped the final surrender document with my pen. "Your luxury life is entirely over, Audrey. The corporate drone just repossessed your entire fake empire, and I have absolutely zero sympathy left to give you today. The sheer finality of my statement echoed through the room, leaving a chilling void in its wake. My mother, Patricia, could no longer maintain her facade of a sophisticated society matriarch. The pristine cream-colored cashmere dress she wore suddenly looked completely absurd against the backdrop of her total emotional collapse. She looked at Jamal, who was still staring at the draft of federal charges. She looked at Audrey, who was wiping mascara from her cheeks. And then she looked at me, her eyes wide with a primal, desperate terror. The reality of impending homelessness finally breached her impenetrable wall of vanity. With a sudden, jagged sob, Patricia slipped out of her ergonomic leather chair. Her knees hit the carpeted floor of the conference room with a heavy thud. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, ignoring the obvious shock on my father's face. She reached the edge of the frosted glass table and gazed up at me, her face contorted into a mask of absolute pathetic agony. "Clara, please," she wailed, her voice cracking with violent desperation. "You cannot do this to your own mother. You cannot take our home away from us. We are old, Clara. Your father and I are supposed to be retiring. We have absolutely nowhere else to go." She clasped her hands together in a gesture of frantic prayer, tears streaming down her face and dripping onto her expensive pearl necklace. She immediately deployed the ultimate victim card, relying on the same toxic emotional manipulation she had used to control me for my entire life. "I am the woman who gave birth to you, Clara. I nourished you and raised you and gave you a beautiful life in that house. You cannot just throw us into the streets like common criminals." We did not understand the complex financial paperwork Jamal was pushing us to sign. We just wanted to help our family succeed. We were tricked by him just like you were. She pointed a trembling finger at Jamal, entirely willing to sacrifice him to save her own skin. "We are just innocent victims in his terrible scam. You know me, Clara. You know I have a good heart. Please just look at me. I am on my knees begging my own flesh and blood for mercy. Let us stay in the house. We will move into the basement suite you renovated. We will live quietly down there and you can have the rest of the property. Just please do not make us homeless. I will die out there on the streets, Clara. I am too fragile to lose everything I have ever known." She continued to sob hysterically, clutching the polished metal leg of the conference table as if it were a literal lifeline. She wanted me to feel immense guilt for surviving her betrayal. She expected the deeply ingrained conditioning of my childhood to magically override the cold, hard facts of their massive financial fraud. She truly believed that crying on the floor would wipe away the memory of her locking me out in a freezing blizzard on Thanksgiving night. Her theatrical performance was utterly nauseating. It was a masterclass in extreme maternal manipulation, completely devoid of any actual genuine remorse for stealing my money. She was only crying for herself. She wailed louder, throwing her head back and demanding that I show some basic human decency. She claimed that punishing her for a simple misunderstanding was a wicked and unnatural act for a daughter to commit. She told me that God would never forgive me for casting my elderly parents out of the only home they had ever cherished. Every single word out of her mouth was entirely focused on her own comfort, completely omitting the fact that she had gleefully demanded $400 from me for a heating bill just days after leaving me out in the deadly cold. I watched her dramatic weeping with the analytical detachment of a scientist observing a predictable chemical reaction. Her tears did not move my heart a single millimeter. I stood up straight, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored blazer. I looked down at the weeping woman kneeling on the floor and felt absolutely nothing. "Your victim routine is completely useless here," I stated, my voice cutting through her hysterical sobbing like a razor blade. "You are not innocent victims. You willingly leveraged your house to fund a fake millionaire lifestyle because your greed vastly outweighed your common sense. You aggressively demanded my house keys and threw me out to protect your fraudulent short sale. I will not allow you to live in my basement. I will not allow you to remain on my property for a single second longer than legally necessary." I reached across the frosted glass table and picked up the thick, formal document detailing the absolute surrender of their home. I slid the deed in lieu of foreclosure forward until it stopped mere inches from my father's hands. The heavy gold pen rested right beside the signature line. "This is the absolute final boundary," I announced, locking eyes with my father, and then glaring down at my mother. "You have exactly 48 hours to vacate my property completely. You will not remove a single appliance, a single light fixture, or a single piece of custom molding. You will leave the house keys on the kitchen counter. You will take your suitcases, and you will get out of my house immediately." I tapped the signature line on the legal document one final time. "If you sign this deed right now, I will formally release you from the debt, and I will refrain from submitting these offshore gambling ledgers to the authorities. But if you refuse to sign, I will file the public foreclosure by noon today, and David will personally hand-deliver this wire fraud packet to the United States Attorney's Office before dinner." I leaned forward, resting my hands on the glass, staring directly into their terrified eyes. "Sign this document right now or go to federal prison. The choice is entirely yours. Make the single easiest decision you have ever made in your completely pathetic lives, and sign the surrender document immediately before I ruin you today." The heavy gold pen trembled in my father's hand as he reached slowly across the frosted glass table. He did not look at me or utter another syllable of defiance. The terrifying reality of federal prison completely crushed whatever remaining pride he possessed. He signed his full name on the deed, surrendering his beloved house and his entire fake legacy. My mother followed suit, her tears staining the legal paper. Jamal practically ripped the pen from her fingers to sign his portion, desperate to avoid the wire fraud charges David had drafted. The moment the wet ink dried, their financial execution was absolute and legally binding. Exactly 48 hours later, my private security team watched them carry their suitcases down the driveway and out of my life forever. It was a truly pathetic sight as they finally walked away. 1 month passed since that brutal reckoning in the conference room. The rapid implosion of their manufactured high society lives was a spectacular display of absolute ruin. The consequences of their boundless greed hit them like a freight train operating at maximum speed. Jamal was the very first casualty of the collapse. Without the fraudulent short sale payout to cover his massive offshore gambling losses, his other creditors immediately began closing in. The luxury car dealership repossessed his custom black Porsche right out of a public parking lot. The shadow investors and underground betting syndicates he owed money to started making aggressive collections calls to his personal phone. Facing total financial annihilation and severe legal threats from multiple furious lenders, Jamal did exactly what a cowardly con artist always does. He packed a single duffel bag in the dead of night and fled the state of Illinois, completely abandoning the family he had gleefully bankrupted. He left Audrey entirely alone to face the catastrophic wreckage of their fake millionaire lifestyle. The golden child woke up one morning to find her husband gone and her bank accounts completely frozen. Audrey had spent the last 2 years gleefully swiping high-interest credit cards to fund her designer wardrobe, her Michelin-star dinners, and her exclusive country club aesthetic. Because she had co-signed every single luxury expense believing Jamal was a tech visionary, she was now solely responsible for hundreds of thousands of dollars in unsecured consumer debt. The collection agencies relentlessly hounded her phone day and night. Her wealthy socialite friends, the same people she used to impress, by mocking my practical career, instantly blocked her number and severed all ties the moment her financial insolvency became public knowledge. Audrey was forced to declare immediate personal bankruptcy, utterly humiliating herself in front of the very elite circles she had sacrificed her own sister to join. She moved into a tiny, dismal studio apartment surviving on cheap noodles and panic. The woman who had proudly handed me a suitcase and kicked me out into a freezing blizzard was now completely isolated, drowning in debt, and entirely stripped of her precious, arrogant vanity. My parents fared no better in the aftermath of their financial surrender. Richard and Patricia had spent decades looking down on working-class people, constructing a toxic identity around their perceived superiority and suburban affluence. Now completely stripped of their home equity and drowning in the lingering remnants of their terrible financial choices, they were violently thrust into the exact demographic they had always openly despised. Without my monthly rent payments or their stolen home equity, they could not secure a lease anywhere near their old neighborhood. They were forced to move into a cramped run-down one-bedroom apartment on the far industrial outskirts of the city. The building smelled faintly of mold and featured a perpetually broken elevator serving as a constant daily reminder of their spectacular fall from grace. Because they had allowed Jamal to gamble away their retirement security, they possessed no remaining financial safety net. To afford groceries and keep the lights on in their dismal new apartment, my elderly parents were forced to re-enter the workforce. My father, who used to boast loudly about his executive status and his expensive golf memberships, had to take a minimum wage job as a greeter at a massive discount retail store. He spent his long, miserable days wearing a bright, cheap polyester vest, handing out metal shopping carts to customers, and enduring the exhausting physical toll of standing on hard concrete floors for 8 uninterrupted hours straight. My mother, Patricia, the snobby woman who once wore expensive cashmere dresses and continuously mocked my sensible career choice, secured employment as a part-time cashier at a local pharmacy. The social humiliation they experienced was absolute and inescapable. Several times a week, former acquaintances from their elite country club would walk through their checkout lines or push shopping carts past my father. The sheer mortification of bagging groceries for the very people they used to host at lavish Thanksgiving dinners slowly destroyed whatever remaining spirit they possessed. They had to look their wealthy former friends directly in the eye while wearing minimum wage name tags. They could no longer hide behind lies about an overseas daughter or a billionaire son-in-law. Their catastrophic failure was public, undeniable, and permanent. The intricate web of deception they had woven to protect their fragile egos had snapped back and strangled them. They spent their evenings sitting in their cramped living room, exhausted and aching bitterly, regretting the cruel choices that had led them to total ruin. They traded a loyal, supportive daughter for a hollow illusion of status, and the universe rewarded them with exactly what they deserved. The brutal reality of their new existence offered no escape hatch and no fraudulent shortcuts. They were forced to wake up every single morning and physically pay the grueling, painful price for their overwhelming greed. Karma did not just knock on their door. It moved in permanently, ensuring they would spend their remaining years fully absorbing the severe consequences of their profound betrayal. 6 months after their bitter departure, I stood in the center of the kitchen, inside the newly reclaimed house. The expansive room was entirely unrecognizable from the space my mother used to dominate. I had hired a premium contracting firm to completely gut the main floor, erasing every single trace of their arrogant aesthetic. The ostentatious crystal chandelier Jamal bought with stolen funds was long gone, replaced by sleek, modern lighting that cast a warm, inviting glow across the natural stone countertops. The oppressive dark mahogany furniture my father favored had been hauled away, leaving a bright open space that finally breathed with genuine peace. The house was completely silent tonight, but it was not the heavy, suffocating silence of unspoken resentment I grew up enduring. It was a profound, beautiful stillness. It was the absolute quiet of a sanctuary fully cleansed of toxic presence and constant manipulation. I walked slowly across the wide, plank hardwood floors, my bare feet completely grounded in the reality of my absolute ownership. I reached into the custom temperature-controlled wine fridge built seamlessly into the new cabinetry and extracted a bottle of vintage Cabernet. I uncorked the bottle with a smooth, fluid motion, listening to the soft, satisfying pop echo in the serene space. I poured the dark ruby liquid into a large crystal glass, watching it catch the ambient light. Taking a slow, deep sip, I let the complex flavors settle on my palate. There was no overwhelming sense of vicious triumph or malicious gloating bubbling in my chest. I did not spend my evenings plotting further revenge or obsessing over my family suffering in their cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city. I simply felt an immense, overwhelming wave of total liberation. I had officially reclaimed the exact physical space where I was once made to feel so incredibly small and insignificant. I transformed the very site of my brutal Thanksgiving eviction into a monument of my own unshakable financial independence. My massive corporate wealth no longer sat hidden away in secret brokerage accounts out of fear of their greedy exploitation. It was now fully integrated into a life I curated entirely on my own terms. I walked over to the large bay window holding my wine glass and looked out at the peaceful snow-covered lawn. The bitter cold wind howled outside, rattling the bare branches of the old oak trees, but I was perfectly safe and warm inside my fortress. The brutal corporate takeover was officially closed, and the books were permanently balanced. I took another long, slow sip of my wine, fully embracing the profound, beautiful tranquility of knowing I would never ever again compromise my own mental well-being to satisfy the endless, draining demands of ungrateful, toxic people. The heavy, crushing burden of being the dependable, overlooked daughter was permanently lifted off my shoulders, leaving me entirely free to enjoy the magnificent, lasting empire I built with my own two hands. I smiled softly inside. They thought that stripping away my home and casting me out into the bitter cold would completely break my spirit. They operated under the arrogant assumption that my entire identity was permanently tied to their constant validation and conditional approval. But they fundamentally misunderstood the core nature of human resilience. Being ruthlessly thrown out into the frozen streets did not destroy my life. It actively and undeniably saved it. The very moment that heavy front door clicked shut behind me, I stopped being their dependable scapegoat. I immediately stopped viewing myself through the distorted lens of their deeply flawed expectations. The harsh reality of their betrayal taught me the most valuable financial and emotional lesson I have ever learned. You can never truly build a secure, lasting future while allowing toxic people to hold the deed to your self-worth. I learned how to aggressively defend my assets and unapologetically enforce my personal boundaries. More importantly, I finally understood that biology does not automatically guarantee loyalty or compassion. Family is not always defined by a shared last name or a matching genetic sequence. True family is an intentional daily choice made by people who consistently show up to support, protect, and respect one another. When people show you exactly who they are through their vicious actions, you must believe them the very first time. You must gather your strength, calculate your next move, and walk away without a single ounce of hesitation. Self-respect ultimately means acknowledging your true value and never ever choosing to sit at a table where you are clearly listed on the menu. You owe absolutely nothing to individuals who view your existence merely as a resource to be exploited for their own selfish gain. You hold the ultimate power to rewrite your own narrative and reclaim your absolute independence. Now, I want to turn this important conversation over to you. Have you ever experienced a devastating betrayal from the very people who were supposed to protect your heart? Have you ever been forced to use your own professional expertise and cold logic to ruthlessly fight back against a toxic family dynamic? How did you finally summon the necessary courage to establish ironclad boundaries and walk away from a destructive environment to build a beautiful, successful life entirely on your own terms? Please share your personal stories of survival and triumph down in the comments section below. I personally read every single one of your unique experiences, and I draw immense inspiration from your incredible, undeniable strength. If my journey of financial reclamation and personal liberation resonated with you today, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Your continued support helps me share these vital stories about navigating difficult family conflicts and reclaiming your personal power. Thank you so very much for watching my video today. And always remember that sometimes the absolute greatest revenge is simply building a brilliant, untouchable empire and thriving completely without them forever and ever. Clara's journey from a dutiful, overlooked daughter to the unapologetic architect of her own destiny teaches a profound lesson about the true nature of boundaries and self-worth. For years, she allowed her family to exploit her financial contributions and emotional loyalty under the guise of unconditional family duty. Her parents and sister demanded endless sacrifices to fund a fabricated illusion of wealth, culminating in a cruel, calculated Thanksgiving eviction. However, the most empowering takeaway from her ordeal is that surviving profound betrayal requires a radical shift in perspective. Clara realized that she could not heal by appealing to the conscience of people who clearly had none. Instead of crumbling under the weight of rejection or begging for their acceptance, she chose to weaponize the cold, hard logic of the financial world to reclaim her power. This story vividly illustrates that biology does not grant anyone a free pass to inflict abuse or commit fraud. True family is built on a solid foundation of mutual respect, not parasitic entitlement. Clara's ultimate victory was not just in acquiring the legal deed to her childhood home. It was in completely dismantling the toxic psychological hold her family had over her for decades. She finally recognized that her intrinsic worth was never tied to their highly conditional approval. By stepping out of the victim role and setting an ironclad boundary, she demonstrated that the most effective response to betrayal is absolute, unwavering independence. Her journey is a brilliant testament to the fact that sometimes losing the people who constantly belittle you is not a tragedy, it is the ultimate liberation. If you have ever had to build a fortress of boundaries to protect your peace from toxic relatives, share your story of reclaiming your power in the comments below.